The first time Karen ran over my hedge, I thought it was an accident. The second time, I started to suspect she was just careless. But the third time, oh, that was war. Karen, the self-appointed ruler of our HOA, had spent years making the neighborhood miserable with her endless complaints and imaginary rules. But when she decided my carefully maintained hedge was an inconvenience to her daily routine, she made a fatal mistake. She underestimated me. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I set the perfect trap. And when Karen's SUV met sweet karma, well, let's just say she never drove over my hedge again. Hello, beautiful peoples. Where are you watching this video from? Our neighborhood was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. The most dramatic event of the year was usually Mrs. Thompson's cat getting stuck in a tree, only for it to climb down 5 minutes later when no one was watching. It was peaceful, predictable, and most importantly, a place where everyone minded their own business. Well, almost everyone. Then there was Karen. Karen wasn't just a regular HOA member. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, ruling with an iron clipboard and a glare that could make even the bravest homeowner rethink their choice of mailbox. She had an uncanny ability to appear the moment anything remotely interesting happened. A package left on a porch for longer than 10 minutes? Karen was there. A trash can brought in at 6:01 p.m. instead of 6 o'clock? Karen took notes. At first, I tried to stay out of her way. I mowed my lawn on time, kept my hedges neatly trimmed, and avoided making eye contact whenever she patrolled the street in her ridiculous sun visor. But as anyone who's ever dealt with a Karen before knows, avoiding her was never really an option. It started small. She knocked on my door one afternoon, a smug look plastered across her face. "Did you know your grass is exactly half an inch longer than HOA regulations allow?" she asked, as if I'd just committed a federal crime. I blinked at her, unsure if she was serious. She was. Then came the complaint letters. The first one was about my unauthorized garden gnome. The second was about my mailbox being too whimsical. The third was because, get this, a single leaf had fallen onto my driveway, and I hadn't picked it up fast enough. But the final straw wasn't the letters or the absurd rules. It wasn't even the time she measured my fence with a ruler and threatened to report me for an imaginary violation. No, the thing that turned our quiet neighborhood into a battlefield was something far worse. Karen kept driving over my hedge. At first, I thought it was an accident. Maybe she misjudged the turn. Maybe she was in a hurry. But then it happened again. And again. My once perfectly trimmed hedge was slowly turning into a mangled, tire-marked mess. And every time I confronted her about it, she just waved me off. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed. "It's just a few plants." A few plants. I had spent months growing that hedge, carefully tending to it, making sure it framed my yard just right. And she had the audacity to treat it like her personal shortcut? That was when I knew. This wasn't just an accident. It was a challenge. And I was about to make sure Karen never drove over my hedge again. The next morning, I stood on my front porch, staring at the fresh set of tire tracks running straight through my hedge. The once proud green shrubs were now flattened like roadkill, branches snapped and leaves scattered like battlefield debris. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, Karen would finally acknowledge the damage and apologize. I should have known better. Karen was strutting down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, looking far too pleased with herself. I intercepted her just as she reached my driveway. "Morning, Karen," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Looks like someone ran over my hedge again." She barely glanced at the wreckage. "Oh well, maybe you should have planted something sturdier." I blinked. "Sturdier?" She gave me that infuriating little smirk, the one that said she knew exactly what she was doing and dared me to do something about it. "It's just a hedge," she said with a dismissive wave. "Honestly, you're lucky I don't report you to the HOA for obstruction. Technically, it's close to the curb. That's a safety hazard." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of the woman. "You mean the curb that's still 2 feet away?" She shrugged. "Rules are rules." Oh, the irony. The same person who just ran over my property was lecturing me about rules. Karen had always been a stickler for imaginary HOA regulations, but this was a new level of insanity. She had taken it upon herself to become the ultimate enforcer of neighborhood order, twisting the guidelines to fit whatever narrative suited her mood. Last summer, she reported Mr. Harris for leaving his garden hose uncoiled on the lawn. A tripping hazard, she called it, even though he had no kids and barely left the house. 2 weeks ago, she handed out written warnings to the Johnsons because their Halloween decorations were too excessive and violating the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. They had 3 plastic pumpkins and a fake spider web. And now, she was trying to justify turning my hedge into a speed bump. I decided to give her one last chance. Karen, all I'm asking is that you be more careful. That hedge wasn't cheap, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't run over it again. Her response? A dramatic sigh and an eye roll so exaggerated I thought she might sprain something. You know, she said, tapping her clipboard like she was about to unveil some grand revelation. I could be spending my time on more important neighborhood concerns. But instead, I have to listen to complaints about shrubs. And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, fuming. That was it. Karen had officially declared war on my hedge. And if she wanted a battle, she was going to get 1.at first. I tried to take the high road. I figured maybe, just maybe, Karen would eventually get bored or find some other minor injustice to crusade against. I even entertained the wild fantasy that she might feel a twinge of guilt and stop using my hedge as her personal off-road shortcut. That fantasy died when I caught her doing it again. This time I saw it happen with my own eyes. She was in her oversized SUV, barely even slowing down as she cut across my yard like she was competing in a monster truck rally. My hedge didn't stand a chance. I stormed outside just as she was getting out of her car, clipboard tucked under her arm like some kind of legal authority. Karen, I called out. She turned, completely unfazed, and gave me a look as if I had just interrupted a very important HOA patrol. Yes, she said, all innocence, as if she hadn't just plowed through my property like it was an inconvenient speed bump. You ran over my hedge. Again. She blinked, then casually glanced back at the tire marks. Oh, did I? I took a deep breath, clenching my fists. Yes, you did. And I need you to stop. I've asked you nicely. Karen let out a dramatic sigh, as if this conversation was such an inconvenience to her busy schedule of neighborhood tyranny. Look, I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. It's just a hedge. It's my property, I reminded her. You wouldn't like it if I drove over your lawn, would you? She gasped, clutching her clipboard like I had just threatened to burn down her house. That would be completely different. How exactly? She floundered for a second, then defaulted to her usual nonsense. Because I follow the HOA rules. There it was. The HOA defense, her favorite weapon. I took a slow breath and nodded. Okay, if you won't stop on your own, I'll have to take other measures. She snorted. What? Are you going to file a complaint? She said it mockingly, as if she was the HOA. Good luck with that. Challenge accepted. I started small. First, I put up a polite little sign near the hedge. Please do not drive over the hedge. Thank you. Karen saw it. She scoffed. And the next morning, she drove over the hedge again. All right. Plan B. I replaced the sign with a more direct one. Karen, stop running over my hedge. That got some attention. The neighbors chuckled. Tom from next door even gave me a thumbs up. Karen? She was livid. The very next day, I got a formal HOA warning taped to my door. Unauthorized signage, it read. Must be removed immediately. Unbelievable. She was actively destroying my property, but the sign was the problem? Fine. If she wanted to play dirty, I could play dirty too. I took my sign down. And then I started planning something a little more permanent. The moment the sign came down, the neighborhood grapevine exploded. It started with Tom from next door. He leaned over our shared fence that afternoon, smirking like he had front-row tickets to the best show in town. So, he said, arms crossed, Karen strike again? I sighed, gesturing to the tire-ravaged hedge. She reported my sign to the HOA. Not the fact that she's been committing vehicular manslaughter on my plants. Tom chuckled. Classic Karen. Last week, she accused my cat of trespassing. I blinked. Your cat? Oh yeah, said he was roaming without a permit. We both stared at each other for a beat before bursting into laughter. Apparently, I wasn't the only victim of Karen's self-appointed HOA dictatorship. As word spread, more neighbors started stopping by with their own stories. Mrs. Patel from 2 houses down told me Karen had reported her for excessively fragrant flowers. The Johnsons shared that they had received a violation notice for their offensively bright holiday wreath. Even Mr. Harris, the quiet retiree on the corner, admitted that she had once banged on his door at 7 a.m. because his recycling bin was out too early. I was starting to realize something important. Nobody actually liked Karen. But while some neighbors gossiped about her antics, others were too afraid to cross her. Karen lived for HOA drama, and she had a way of making people's lives miserable if they dared to fight back. "She once tried to get my car towed for parking an inch over my driveway," said Lisa, shaking her head. "She measured my grass with a ruler," added Greg. A ruler. Even those who had never been direct victims seemed to relish the drama unfolding. The moment Karen and I crossed paths outside, people found excuses to linger. They watered their lawns, took very slow walks, or suddenly remembered they needed to check the mail. It was like a live soap opera, and I was one of the starring characters. Karen, of course, acted completely oblivious to the growing rebellion. She continued her daily patrols, clipboard clutched like a royal decree, barking at people about their fences, flower beds, and porch decorations. But the difference now? More and more people were starting to push back. Greg put up a plastic flamingo on his lawn, just to spite her. Mrs. Patel started using extra fragrant mulch. And Tom printed a massive laminated sign for his cat's collar that read, "Licensed Neighborhood Menace." The tide was turning, and I was about to deliver the final blow. Karen's reign of terror was starting to crack, but she didn't know it yet. While the neighbors were slowly turning against her, she was too blinded by her self-importance to notice. She was still convinced she was in charge, still convinced that her ridiculous HOA rules were the law of the land. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. One evening, I heard the familiar crunch of tires over my hedge. Again. But this time I was ready. I had installed security cameras the day before. The footage was crystal clear. Karen's massive SUV rolling right over my poor hedge like it was nothing, her smug expression completely unbothered as she did it. But the real kicker? As she pulled away, she nearly hit my mailbox. That was all I needed. The next day, I marched straight to the HOA meeting, USB drive in hand. Now, if you've never been to an HOA meeting, let me paint a picture. It's basically a room full of grumpy homeowners, sitting in plastic chairs, pretending to care about landscaping regulations while secretly wondering when they can go home. Karen, of course, was seated front and center, clipboard at the ready. She barely spared me a glance when I walked in, too busy whispering to one of her minions about the terrible state of Greg's lawn. But when I walked up to the front and plugged in my USB drive, the room went silent. The footage played on the big screen. Karen, her SUV, my hedge, over and over from multiple angles. And then the piece de resistance, her nearly taking out my mailbox. The room erupted. "Is that Karen's car?" Someone whispered. "Oh my God, she really did run it over. She almost hit the mailbox, too. That's got to be an HOA violation." Karen turned beet red. "This is ridiculous," she screeched. "It's just a hedge." But the damage was done. The HOA president, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, slowly turned toward Karen. "Karen," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "are you aware that damaging another homeowner's property is against HOA regulations?" Karen stammered. I was just. And that driving on a neighbor's lawn is considered trespassing?" The room was dead silent, all eyes on Karen. Linda sighed and reached for her stack of paperwork. "Effective immediately, you are being issued a formal violation for reckless driving within the neighborhood, destruction of property, and repeated HOA misconduct." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You can't do that." "Oh, we can," Linda said, flipping through the bylaws. "And, seeing as this is your third violation in the past 6 months, you're also being removed from your position as head of the HOA Complaints Committee." The room erupted into whispers. "Karen fired?" She was shaking with rage. "This is outrageous. I have dedicated years to this community." Linda raised an eyebrow. "And now it's someone else's turn." Karen's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But all her usual supporters avoided eye contact. Even her most loyal minions looked uncomfortable. For the first time, Karen was alone. And she knew it. She stormed out of the meeting in a huff, muttering about how we'd all regret this, how the neighborhood was doomed without her leadership. But the moment the door shut behind her, the entire room burst into applause. And I just sat back, arms crossed, and enjoyed the show. Karen's downfall was glorious, but the best part was yet to come. With her HOA power stripped away, Karen had lost her biggest weapon. No more clipboard patrols, no more passive-aggressive notices, and no more imaginary rule enforcement. But did that stop her from being a menace? Of course not. If anything, losing her HOA status made her worse. She sulked for a few days, shooting death glares at anyone who dared look in her direction. Then, true to form, she doubled down on her pettiness. She started parking her SUV in the most obnoxious ways possible. Halfway into the street, too close to driveways, even once blocking my mailbox entirely. It was like she wanted everyone to suffer for her humiliation. And of course, she still couldn't resist driving over my hedge. But here's the thing. While Karen had been busy throwing a tantrum, I had been busy too. I had reinforced my hedge. Not with extra plants. Not with taller stakes. No, I had gone for something much more effective. A row of discreetly placed decorative rocks, nestled just inside the greenery. Big enough to make an impact, small enough to blend into the landscaping. And on one fateful afternoon, Karen met them head-on. I was in my front yard when it happened. Karen, still bitter about her downfall, came flying around the corner as usual, her SUV barreling straight toward my hedge. Except this time, instead of crunching through leaves, there was a sickening scrape. Then bam! Her front wheel hit one of the hidden rocks at just the right angle, and the entire SUV lurched. There was an awful grinding noise as the undercarriage scraped along the jagged edges, and then, hisses. Karen's eyes went wide. She slammed on the brakes and jumped out just in time to see her front tire deflate completely, hissing air like an angry snake. The rock had punctured it beautifully. I watched as she stood there, fuming, her face going through the 5 stages of grief in real time. Disbelief. Rage. Denial. More rage. Then she spun toward me. "You did this on purpose," she screeched. I raised an innocent eyebrow. "Did what?" "Oh, did you hit one of my decorative landscaping rocks?" Her eye twitched. "You put those there to sabotage me." I shrugged. "Karen, you've been repeatedly driving over my property. I was just protecting my hedge." She clenched her fists so hard her knuckles turned white. "This is illegal. I'll sue you for." "Sue me for putting rocks in my own yard?" I interrupted, crossing my arms. "Go ahead. Let's see how that holds up in court." She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Then she turned bright red and stormed back to her SUV, which was now sitting lopsided on its deflated front tire. And to make matters worse, the HOA president, Linda, happened to be driving by at that exact moment. She slowed down, rolled down her window, and took in the scene, the tire, the rocks, the unmistakable Karen-shaped rage. She let out a little hum. "Karen, you do know that HOA rules strictly prohibit driving on someone else's lawn, right?" Karen practically vibrated with fury. "Looks like you'll need a tow truck," Linda continued, oh sweetly. "Oh, and don't forget, that's another HOA violation. You'll be fined for the damages." I thought Karen's head was going to explode. But the best part? The entire neighborhood was watching. People were standing in doorways, peeking through windows, pretending to check their mail. Tom, bless him, had actually pulled up a lawn chair. Karen knew she had lost. With one final glare, she stomped back to her car and called for a tow truck. And when the truck arrived and pulled her SUV away, it revealed the final cherry on top. A giant, ugly scrape all along the bottom of her bumper. She never drove over my hedge again. After that fateful day, the neighborhood changed. Karen still lived here, technically, but it was like she had been permanently defanged. She stopped strutting around with her clipboard, stopped handing out ridiculous violation notices, and, most importantly, stopped using my hedge as her personal shortcut. Word of her downfall spread like wildfire. For weeks, people whispered about the Hedge incident, like it was some legendary battle. Tom, ever the opportunist, even made a dramatic retelling of it at our next block party, complete with sound effects and exaggerated tire screeching noises. "She came around the corner like a bat out of hell," he'd say, dramatically miming a steering wheel. Then bam! The SUV met its match, the rocks of justice. It never got old. Karen, on the other hand, was not amused. For a while, she tried to save face. She pretended nothing had happened, avoided eye contact with anyone who so much as smirked in her direction, and refused to acknowledge the absolute masterpiece of karma that had played out for the entire street to witness. But she never really recovered. Without her HOA power, she had nothing left. No one listened to her complaints. No one took her threats seriously. She tried to report someone for an unauthorized wind chime, and Linda just laughed and shut the door in her face. And then one day, just like that, Karen was gone. A moving truck showed up in her driveway early one Saturday morning. No dramatic farewell, no final power trip, just the quiet, almost pathetic sight of her belongings being packed away. By noon, the SUV, The very same one that had met its demise on my reinforced hedge was gone. The entire neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in years, there was peace. No more random citations. No more fear of waking up to a complaint letter taped to the door. No more HOA dictatorship. And as I stood on my porch that evening, sipping my coffee, I took in the glorious sight of my hedge, fully recovered, standing proud and green once more. Tom wandered over, hands in his pockets, grinning. "So," he said, nodding toward the now vacant house. "Think the new neighbors will be normal?" I shrugged. Hard to be worse than Karen. We stood there for a moment, soaking in the tranquility. No Karen, no chaos, just a quiet, HOA drama-free existence. I took another sip of my coffee and smirked. For the first time in years, I said, I think I can let my grass grow 1 whole inch without fear. And with that, the neighborhood finally moved on. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare or an entitled neighbor like Karen? Share your story in the comments. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have gone for a bigger revenge or kept it subtle? What's the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever heard of? Let's see who has the craziest one. Do you think Karen deserved what happened, or was the revenge too much? Be honest.